We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Down in my heart, it's true. I
I look for a place, dark brother, where the white shadow of racism does not fall. There is no such place, my sister, no such place at all. Good afternoon. It's my honor to welcome you to the 11th annual Stand Against Racism. I am your host, Lou Rochelle Brim Atkins. I'm a longtime partner of the YWCA and a proud member of the People of Color Executive Council, better known as POCEC. The Stand Against Racism is a nationwide campaign from YWCA and its partners. Each year in April, we come together to raise awareness about the effects of structural racism and to build community for anti-racist organizers. Today's event is presented by the POCEC, which has hosted the Stand Against Racism in Seattle since 2011. It's grown significantly under their stewardship, and today we have more than 300 guests tuned in from across the region. Thank you for being here today and supporting this mission. We're holding this event virtually to protect the health and safety of our community as we continue to grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic. Even though we're not in the same room, you can still join the conversation. Please use the chat to tell us where you're from and why you've joined us. Now, we'd like to start the program with a few words from Denise Stiffarm, YWCA Board Chair and fellow POCEC member.
Good afternoon. I'm Denise Stiffarm, an enrolled member of the Ahani Nation, the White Clay people. As the incoming chair of the YWCA Board of Directors and a member of the People of Color Executive Council, I'm honored to welcome you to the 11th annual Stand Against Racism. We are broadcasting today from the city of Seattle, which sits on the occupied ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people who continue to steward this land and its waters as they have done since time immemorial. Indigenous people original to this region and from around the Americas call this area home and today live, work, and contribute to this great community. We honor and appreciate the historic and modern day contributions of all Black, Indigenous, and people of color in our region. We also recognize and acknowledge that racist policies and practices in our history and continuing to present day have oppressed, marginalized, and exploited these communities. We offer these land and labor acknowledgements as a tool to help better understand our collective history so we can move forward together on the path towards justice and equity. YWCA is dedicated to ending racial disparities and fighting injustice, and we stand together in the belief that all people, regardless of race, creed, or ethnicity, deserve to be treated with dignity, respect, compassion, and justice. Thank you for joining YWCA on a mission to stand against racism today and every day.
Thank you, Denise, for reminding us to acknowledge and hold space for the history and people of this land. If you're outside the Pacific Northwest and know the indigenous tribes connected to the land where you live, please share that information with us in the chat. I'd also like to thank our chat moderators who are ready to answer your questions and comments. Now it's time for the Stand Against Racism Pledge. This was adapted from the Pledge to Heal Racism in My Life by the Internet Communities United for Justice and Peace. You can find a link in the chat to read and download the pledge. In previous years, it was our tradition for everyone in the audience to recite these words together as an act of collective solidarity. Because we can't do that in this virtual format, I'd like to ask that each of you recite the pledge along with us at home, at work, or wherever you are. Add your voice to the chorus of YWCA board, staff, and community members who are taking the pledge to stand against racism.
With conviction and hope, I take this pledge, fully aware that the struggle to end racism will not end with a mere pledge, but with transformation within myself and the institutions and structures of our society.
I pledge to look deeply and continuously in my heart and my mind to identify all signs and vestiges of racism.
I pledge to expand my consciousness to be more aware of and sensitive to my use of overt and subtle expressions of racism and racial stereotypes.
I pledge to rebuke racist behavior and language towards others, and to root out racism in my own life, in my encounters with persons I know and with strangers I don't know.
I pledge to promote public policy solutions that prominently, openly, and enthusiastically support racial equity in all aspects of human affairs.
I pledge, within my means, to support and dedicate my time to YWCA and other organizations working to eradicate racism from our society.
YWCA is on a mission to eliminate racism and empower women.
I stand.
I stand
against racism.
I stand against racism.
I join YWCA in taking a stand against racism today and every day.
To the community partners, board members, and staff who contributed to that video, we appreciate your commitment and leadership in the fight for racial equity. And thanks to all of you for reciting the pledge along with them. Community is powerful. As we all strive to stand against racism individually and collectively, remember that it truly takes all of us. Each one of us has a part to play in dismantling systemic racism so that we can ensure every person in our community can live free from the negative impacts of racism. This year, we're going to talk about race, gender, and journalism, focusing on the wide array of local media working to change harmful and racist narratives. While the mediums may have changed from printed pamphlets to TikTok videos, media undoubtedly still holds a strong influence in every aspect of our lives. It educates, aggravates, informs, and sparks conversation. For all too long, the narratives have been controlled by those who support and uphold the status quo within mainstream media. With the diversification and expansion of media, the stories and history of BIPOC communities are being told by us and spread across the globe. And while historically media has been used as a tool of oppression, it can also be used as a tool of liberation and empowerment, especially in the fight for racial and gender equality. Before our panelists start to talk about these issues in more depth, we wanted to showcase what this looks like in our own community and focus on the legacy of Black media in Seattle.
The legacy of Black-owned media in Seattle has been overlooked for too long, but it's always been here to serve the African-American community. Seattle Medium is an important part of this legacy. Started in 1970 by Chris Bennett Sr., it is one of the oldest Black-owned newspapers in Seattle. Today, it remains family-owned and operated and continues to deliver news that matters to Black communities across the region.
There was a void, there was a need in the community to have a publication that really could speak from our perspective as Black people and tell our truth and tell our sides of the story. People from the community came to my father and said, hey, you know, we really could use a publication that really is from the community and by the community. And he took that to heart. And with $30 and a prayer, he started a newspaper. Our first edition was on January 15th, 1970, which was MLK's birthday. When you talk about the Black press in America was founded on the the notion that we intend to plead our own cause. Too long others have pled our cause for us, which means that we need to have our own voices. We need to speak for ourselves, and we need to be able to have institutions and communications outlets in our community that really can tell our story from our perspective. News is a documentation of history, and the person who is telling that narrative is going to dictate what that reality is to people in the future. Yes. And so we don't have people who look like you, who look like me, who live in this community telling our story from our perspective. It's going to get distorted, it's going to get omitted, and we're going to have to be dealing with untrue history. Who's going to tell those stories if we're not here to tell them? Who's going to tell the stories about Judge Hightower when she was running for office as a write-in candidate and won that election? Who's going to tell the stories about our kids and our future? And who's going to tell the stories about not just the negative stuff that's going on in our community, but the positive things that are going on in our community? Absolutely. And so that's why Black media is important.
Converge Media was built on this legacy. A local news and media company started in 2017 by Omari Salisbury, it is now a leading producer of culturally relevant videos, podcasts, and street-level news coverage in Seattle and across the Pacific Northwest.
I've had almost a 20-year career in media, and so I spent the majority of my career overseas. And so I've been to about 60 countries altogether, 30 of them on the continent of Africa. Those are the people that I've looked up to my whole career. Black media house owners that own media on an international scale and impact tens, if not hundreds of millions of people. And I just knew that when I came home, I wanted to literally take this wealth of experience that I've learned and be able through media to uplift my community. Actually, Converge wasn't envisioned as like a news platform. Converge was envisioned as just a distribution platform for content creators around the Pacific Northwest. Because see what happens, we have brilliant people in our community, right? How can I create a platform for our community to uplift content creators across the Pacific Northwest? And so Converge was never about me. Converge was about everybody else. Somehow through coverage of the protests and things, I've become focused and centered on it. This is why Black media is important, because in crisis, again, crisis in the protests, crisis in COVID, people can turn to an internationally respected and awarded media outlet that's Black and represents their community for the best news and information.
The power of communities of color-run media has propelled the movement for accountability and justice. There's a vast array of media outlets working to change false narratives by telling stories that matter to our communities, by folks who are from and represent those communities. Black-owned media in Seattle and beyond will continue to play an important role in our community today and for generations to come.
We deeply appreciate what the Seattle Medium and Converge Media are doing to uplift and celebrate the Black community. I'd also like to thank the host of that video and fellow POCEC member, Judge Judith Hightower. Now it's time to hear from our panelists who will take a deep dive into the intersectional issues of racism and journalism. Naomi Ishisaka, Marcus Harrison Green, and Florangela Davila. There will be time for audience Q&A at the end, so please ask your question in the chat and a moderator will pass it along to our speaker. The conversation will be led by Naomi Ishisaka, who has over 2 decades of experience in journalism and photography. I can imagine that many of you remember Colors Northwest, where Naomi was editor-in-chief for 8 years. I loved that magazine and miss it. Or you've seen her work in the Seattle Times, where she is a social justice columnist and Assistant Managing Editor for Diversity, Inclusion, and Staff Development. Please welcome Naomi.
Thank you so much to the YWCA, to Lou Rochelle, and particularly the POCEC for opening space for this conversation today. It's such an honor to be with you all. First, I just wanted to say that to start that we are critical of journalism because we want the work we do is important and we want it to be better. At our best, journalists shape what we know about the world around us, hold power to account, and can amplify injustices the public doesn't know about yet. But local journalism is under great threat. The rise of Google and Facebook, media consolidation, hedge fund ownership have contributed to gutting local journalism across the country and given rise to ghost papers and news deserts. Seattle has been impacted by this as well. In recent years, we've lost one daily newspaper, seen our alternative weeklies struggle and diminish, lost magazines that serve specific audiences, including the one Lou Rochelle mentioned that I edited for many years, Colors Northwest, as well as lost online sources like the Seattle Globalist, which thoughtfully covered people of color and immigrants in our city. A 2018 UNC study showed that 1,300 communities are now news deserts with no local news coverage at all. This is bad for all of us. But a lot of what is threatening journalism and why many communities do not trust mainstream media is also self-inflicted. It's the self-inflicted part that we're going to be talking about today. For almost all of our history, US journalism has not fulfilled its promise of, quote, comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. In fact, it actively reinforced and upheld white supremacy and racism for generations. The media justified terrorism like lynchings, and then later the system of mass incarceration we have today as just two examples of many. More and more media organizations are beginning to take responsibility for their roles in perpetuating racism, including the Seattle Times. Last month, we published the first installment of a project to look back critically at our coverage. Our recent multimedia project called A1 Revisited looked at how we not only failed to accurately report on the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, but apologized for the impact of our coverage. But racism still deeply permeates the media industry. Thankfully, there's now greater acknowledgement that, quote, objectivity is fundamentally subjective. But nonetheless, media is still a white-dominated industry where voices of marginalized people are too few and far between. This disparity in who reports and decides the news affects what stories are seen as worthy to tell or what's considered relatable. It affects how racial stereotypes are perpetuated, and it affects who is served by the policies and systems we create. One example of this is the coverage of missing and murdered Indigenous women and people. I wrote a few months ago how the media gave wall-to-wall coverage to Gabby Petito's disappearance, while the lives of thousands of Native women and girls who've gone missing in recent years have been ignored. According to the Justice Department, Native American women are up to 3 times as likely to experience violence, sexual assault, or stalking as any other racial group. But you would not know this from media coverage. The so-called missing white woman syndrome has life or death implications for women and girls of color. Another recent example of this is how the media reported on Ukrainian refugees and how refugees from Syria or migrants from the southern border are depicted. The differences in portrayals shape our policies and how much empathy and support we offer into which groups. But not all is grim. As you saw in the video earlier, we're fortunate to have in our region outstanding journalists of color who center the voices and concerns of marginalized people every day in their work and transform and shape our society in the process. 2 of the best are here with me today, Marcus Harrison Green and Florangela Davila. And let me tell you a little bit about them. Florangela Davila is the news director of the local NPR station KNKX, where she's transformed the newsroom and is broadening the content to look and sound more inclusive and more racially and ethnically representative of the region. Previously, she led a similar transformation at Crosscut, KCTS 9. Florangela is the former race and immigration reporter at the Seattle Times and was named as one of Seattle's most influential people by Seattle Magazine. Very well deserved. Marcus Harrison Green is the publisher of the South Seattle Emerald and a columnist with the Seattle Times. Growing up in South Seattle, he experienced firsthand the impact of one-dimensional stories on marginalized communities, which taught him the value of authentic narratives. After an unfulfilling stint in the investment world during his 20s, Marcus returned to his community with a newfound purpose of telling stories with nuance, complexity, multidimensionality, with the hope of advancing social change. This led him to become a writer and found the South Seattle Emerald. He was awarded the Seattle Human Rights Commission's Individual Human Rights Leader Award for 2020. Please welcome Florangela and Marcus. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Naomi.
So I wanted to get started by just helping the audience understand how, in your experience, in your perspective, the media has been used to perpetuate stereotypes about and justify violence against BIPOC communities. Marcus, when you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'll say, this kind of hits close to home, but for me, it continues to be how Black folks are treated, how the framing around us, the framing around our suffering many times. I tell this story quite often, and so I'll tell it again. I remember when I first started out at the Emerald, I was doing a piece on collecting good thoughts about collecting people's opinions on what was good about South Seattle. And I remember talking to a young man, and he said, "There's nothing good about South Seattle, and there's nothing good about me." And I was like, "Oh, okay, why is that?" And he was like, "Well, folks say that I'm a savage. That's what they say about us." And he was talking about the media at the time. And about 2 weeks later, tragically, I found out that the young man had been shot and killed. And I always wondered, and I still wonder to this day, that's one of the reasons why I do what I do, is that if there was a different narrative out there about him, about his community, about the people who look like him, would there have been some alternatives for him? Would he have thought that there was maybe a different narrative that he would have attached himself to, as opposed to the narrative that he was essentially an animal, right? We are what we continually, feed ourselves, and what we continually consume in our media constantly, and whether we are aware of it or not. And so the fact that many people, like that young man, internalize these false, quite frankly, narratives about them, and treat them as true, and sort of go down, pathways. To me, those are the things that, you might say unintended consequences, or perhaps intended consequences, of not presenting, stories in ways that are, that are truly, accurate in terms of allowing people to be their full humanity. And I think that's, when you have anti-Black coverage, when you have racist coverage, that is exactly what it is. It's a denial of somebody's full humanity.
Thank you, Marcus. Florangela?
Yeah, absolutely. Marcus, thank you for saying what you said. I still hold on to this memory of, I was in a car with a reporter and who lived in Magnolia. And I remember we happened to be driving down through the Rainier Valley, and he characterized it as ugly. Oh, so ugly. And I remember not saying anything. That was then. This is now. I probably would have said something, but this was, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago. And I remember thinking, this is where I live. And this looks so much like the apartments that I grew up in Southern California. And I think part of what is changing, I'll say that, but what we've seen, having been in this local market for a long time, is just being ignored, just being dismissed, just being boxed into certain stereotypes. For example, my ears now perk up whenever I hear Spanish on the broadcast in our shows. Growing up, I can't tell you when I've ever heard the Spanish language on an English language station. I could go to the Spanish language stations, but what does that do to communities, bilingual communities, name any community, when you don't hear your language, when it's not seen as something of who you are, something to be proud of? I think what is changing is there are more people in the room who are asking these questions and are pushing back and are challenging what has been the typical way of covering things.
Florangela, can you talk a little bit more about how communities themselves, when they, like how that kind of attitude about Rainier Valley, for example, like manifests itself in coverage, when you kind of approach a community with that sense of like, this is not something that's desirable or has any value or worth? I know I also live in Rainier Valley, so. And
yeah, I know. I think that all three of us do, which is actually a really nice common thing we have. I mean, I think what's hard is you have two almost battles that you have to do. You have to convince your editors at the time that there's value in sending us and giving us time to explore stories that may not be apparent, that may not be coming from a press release, and that may not be the typical narrative, like we're going into these communities after violence is struck. Which is oftentimes the starting point when we parachute into undercovered communities. But then the flip side is when you do go into communities, there's trust to be built, because the only time you've seen the media trucks and the reporters and people taking time and sitting in people's homes is in the aftermath of those violent situations. And I'm not saying those stories shouldn't be covered. We can talk a lot about the framing of those stories that have been passed, but those are certainly newsworthy stories that we need to be covering. But an anecdote I used to talk about a lot when I was teaching was the first snowfall in the city, and how sometimes I would see the editors assign the photographers to the top of Queen Anne because it was actually easier to get to from where the offices were located, or the editor had just left their home on Queen Anne and saw a really joyful scene of people playing in the snow, and that looked really pretty. And if you don't have people coming from other parts of town who have that same thing, I can tell you there are a lot of pretty snow scenes in Rainier Valley, or you don't have photographers who live close by who could walk over and get that photo. That is a missed opportunity. And so when communities don't see themselves holistically profiled in all different ways, which is why I'm so happy that the South Seattle Emerald exists, because it comes from a place of we see you and we want to hear your stories in all dimensions. That's how you build trust. That takes time. It's not something quick and dirty, which is often, journalism is a profession under deadlines, and we're trying to get the story right. But sometimes getting the story right, getting the right story takes time.
Marcus, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
I mean, just a couple of amens to Florangela, and thank you for the shout out. But yeah.
So kind of follow up on that thread. What are some examples of media double standards when it comes to how communities are covered or not? And can you talk a little bit about who decides which of these stories gets attention in the media and which ones are sort of cast aside or deemed not important? Marcus, you want to start?
Yeah, I think a fairly clear example for me was a shooting that happened in downtown Seattle on 2nd Avenue, I believe it was. This is maybe 3 years ago. And, there was just a avalanche of media coverage around it. There's the mayor at the time. It was going around to every single business, asking people if they were okay. I think it was in our local news cycle for about 2 weeks or so. And I'm not saying that it shouldn't have been, but then you contrast that with a shooting that happened at a few years later at I believe it was a middle school game, high school, a Pee Wee League football game. And thankfully nobody was hurt, but just the fact that there were children present and could have potentially been hurt. And the fact is that when there are shootings of folks that are killed over in the South End, it doesn't quite get the same level, if you will, of just empathy and compassion. It seems very asymmetrical when it comes to that. I remember covering a story of a young man who I happened to go to high school with, Latrell Williams, and he was shot and killed. Nobody to this day, nobody knows exactly what happened. He was, and the news media treated him like a statistic. It was, buried, if not not mentioned at all in many places. And yet, this young man had a mother. He was a single father who was trying to raise his son on his own. And does he also not deserve the same level of dignity and grace and attention, to his case as other cases? But the fact that it happened in there, in Skyway, where not a lot of people necessarily give a lot of coverage to normally anyhow, definitely played, I think, a huge factor in that. I'll say I've talked to young journalists at a variety of locations who say when they bring up certain things, happening in Skyway or Rainier Beach or Mount Baker or Beacon Hill, what they get back from certain editors is, well, how would this actually, why would somebody from Magnolia or Denny Blaine, care about this? How do we, how can you write this story or convey to them, right, that this actually matters? And, I wonder how many times the reverse is true in an editorial meeting where they're saying, okay, well, how does this story actually impact and affect, and how can we make it of concern to folks in Rainier Beach and Skyway? So I'd say that's that's definitely an issue that continues in terms of sort of the asymmetry of what matters and what does not.
Thanks, Marcus. Florangela?
There's a great story that I just reread in the Columbia Journalism Review that talked about the recent heat wave and the visual coverage of how that story was told. So, and this is how news happens, right? Something happens in the world or in the community, and newsrooms everywhere look at it and start figuring out what's the questions that we need to be asking, who is it impacting? And the criticism on that heat wave and how it was visually presented was, a lot of the starting points was the golden retriever lapping and playing in a fountain, and other kids maybe frolicking near the water, white children frolicking in the water, sort of the inconvenience of the heat wave. Oh shoot, I don't have air conditioning in my office, which are all legitimate starting points. What happens is, where is the immediate of the unsheltered and how that's feeling, how that's impacting that population, the person who's incarcerated, what's the situation there, the agricultural worker. And when these stories present themselves, the importance of having different people in the room, not only pitching stories or thinking about those audiences, but then signing off on those stories. If you don't have that mindset while you're trying to figure out what's the story of the day and how am I going to present it, and also thinking about who the audience is, which is what Marcus is getting at, is sort of this angle, this impact of the story may be appropriate for this audience, but let's have a broader lens of who the audience is, because there may be those of us who are tied to agricultural workers and are thinking about our family members who are out there in the heat, or thinking about the unhoused. That is, I think, the responsibility that we have as journalists that hasn't always been front and center.
Right, like who is the we that we're talking about, right?
Right, and I
we are not the we.
Right, we're not the we. And from, again, because I'm in radio and from the broadcast angle, one thing that's really bothered me, frankly, that I hear, and I'm often sending emails to the network, because we have a lot of these discussions in the newsroom that I'm in, and I'm really proud of our reporters and our hosts who ask these questions, but is something like the replacement of derogatory names, the movement to change the geographical names that are happening in the country, right? Why do we need to hear the slur? do we need to hear the slur for an Indigenous woman? Can we just get away with calling it the SQ word and then assume that the listener is intelligent enough to know exactly what we're talking about? This is a story that's been ongoing and ongoing. For certain ears, hearing the slur may not make a difference, but for other people's ears, it is really offensive and hurtful. And so who's your audience? What's the right thing to do? Time and time again, that's the issue that we're facing, is that, it's that cringe, it's that awful, like, why do I need to stomach this? Why do I need to have to stomach this kind of framing, or stomach that this question wasn't asked, or this person wasn't represented fully, or this angle wasn't there? When you say essential worker, who are you thinking about? And again, it goes back to, I think, input from your listeners and your viewers who are noticing that and maybe calling you out for not doing your job, and then also input from people around the table making the decisions.
Thanks, Florangela. So shifting gears a little bit to talk about some of the challenges that exist for journalism, particularly independent journalism. What are the primary challenges, as you see it, facing journalism as it relates to confronting racism and covering our communities more accurately and completely? Florangela, do you want to start, since I've been starting with Marcus?
Sure. I think the biggest challenge is really the complexion of newsrooms. Really just having more lived experiences, a more racially diverse group of storytellers, whether they are the reporters out in the field, whether they're the editors, the photographers, copy editors, all of it. It matters. Again, the best storytelling is, especially for a general audience, you want more people who reflect the region that you're serving, the audience that you're serving. And so that's how you come up with good ideas. That's how you talk through your stories. And that's how you catch yourself after the fact that you're not missing a viewpoint. I think that's the most critical thing. And Naomi, I know, because you've been in the business a long time when we used to work together, this is not a new thing. We've been talking about this for a long time, that if this is the reason why you need to have more journalists of color in your newsrooms. It's as simple as, we're going to notice things that are missing. We're going to ask those questions. We can't help it because we're thinking of our family and our friends and our circles and our neighborhoods. We're thinking about our Rainier Valleys versus our Magnolias. And that's informative. And we're also ready to intersect all of those lenses on an array of subjects and beats, because that's the other challenge, is that, yes, you can have a reporter covering a certain community in the newsroom, but is that reporter also having a voice on broader issues, the biggest story of the day? Or are they themselves being marginalized into a certain section of the paper, or a certain segment on a broadcast that's kind of an afterthought? How central are they? How central is their coverage so that it is receiving maximum exposure?
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, and completely agree with everything you just said. I think, as we bring more journalists of color into our newsrooms, I don't think there's ever been a time where there's been more ways in which journalists can be harassed and threatened and otherwise targeted, and especially journalists of color. And I think as we bring those more folks, as we should, we have to figure out ways in which we can make it so that it's not a terrible, toxic experience for them as well, right? And I think we haven't really cracked the code on that. We're still working on trying to attack that, but I think it's going to be very, very hard.
Right. Oh, and I would say, and also acknowledging that you don't have one Latina reporter who represents the entire community, is that there's people are multidimensional, people have different backgrounds. You could have 5 Latinas in a newsroom and you're still not doing enough, because everybody comes from a different place and a different class and a different background. And that's also some of the work that we need to do as leaders in the industry.
Yeah. Marcus?
Yeah, I just only, well, one, I would just second every single thing that both of you said. I would say also just making sure that when the folks are in those newsrooms, that they're actually, as Florangela said, actually empowered to do something. I mean, it doesn't matter how many folks you have sort of in the, the more menial roles, but do you have, folks of color in upper management? Do you have folks at the executive editor position level, and do they actually have legitimate power, or are they just being tokenized, right? I mean, there's that whole there's been a whole kerfuffle around the New York Times editor that they went from a Black man in Dean Bouquet, who I know had his faults, as we all do, to sort of the back to what has been sort of standard in the media industry. We have, I think one poll that I saw, it said it's 82% white and 63% male. How can you at all ever hope to build trust within a community when the people who are the liaisons, if you will, and mediators for what is told about a community, don't share a life experience, don't share complexion, and many times, don't share the same levels of understandings within a community. And so I think one of the harder parts too is trying to build a pipeline for folks into journalism, right? I was talking to somebody the other day, and they were asking advice. They'll be graduating from high school soon, and they said they would love to be a journalist, but why in the world would they actually want to major in journalism at the University of Washington or SU or elsewhere? They get a 4-year degree, going into debt $30,000 to $40,000 or more, for a position that may or may not exist when they get out. And so why not go into something else, especially being from a place like South Seattle, that why not go into another major or another industry that they know can actually make money? And so I think we also have to solve that problem as well. How do we get folks, in the door who, maybe don't have necessarily a traditional, haven't followed a traditional pathway, if you will, into journalism, and how do we create opportunities for them? And how do we make entering into this industry much more accessible for folks?
That's such a great point, Marcus. I think that cost benefit calculation is so real for so many people, and we've kind of overvalued some things and way undervalued other things. Whereas a person's experience, and their perspective is valuable enough. So I want to move on, ask how you think the media could be used to disrupt racism, and what you think is the road to change, and then what you do in your role to kind of bend that arc. Marcus, why don't you start?
Okay, I was gonna have Florangela go, since I went the first 2 times first. I was trying to be equitable here, since it's all about equity, but but no, I think one of the things that the media can simply do is to tell the truth, right? To tell the truth, and not have sort of this false binary, right? That where it's well, I got to hear also from this other side or whatever, and when it comes to, does racism actually exist? And I mean, I think we can call things what they are. And I think one of the hardest things about media journalism as a business, I'll say, is that, right, it's always going to be more lucrative to tell people what they want to hear versus telling people what they need to hear. And I think that's one of the reasons, quite frankly, that I did found the South Seattle Emerald as a nonprofit as opposed to a for-profit business, so that it could be more mission driven, so that it could continue to sort of align with the values that we have, which is just trying to shine a light on society, to go to where the darkness is and to reveal the light. And unfortunately, that does mean that we get a lot of criticism, and it was just called, I got an email being called the N-word just last week, as a matter of fact, for some of our coverage. But I think at the end of the day, what we can do is just, truly speak the truth. There's a saying that one of the biggest issues that is wrong with America and our society at this moment is the fact that just nobody can agree on what the truth actually is. And I think, we just need to, as we move forward, we just need to continue to reiterate the truth day in and day out, every single day.
Thanks, Marcus. Florangela?
Yeah, my turn to say amen, Marcus. I mean, I think, you know, there is so much contention over the differences that we have among us. And while that is true, I think it's our responsibility to lean in and explain who people are fully, and give people a better sense of the life that people are living and the struggles that they're facing and the systems that they are faced with and the racism that is happening. I think, you know, more accountability journalism. I think that's also the power of investigative work, because sometimes it takes a lot of stories to be presented to a listener or a viewer who refuses to acknowledge that there's systems in place that are racist. But it's hard to ignore if you have a lot of the facts and you're showing trends and you're presenting the data and you're just putting it out there and saying, why is this happening to this person versus this person over this many years? And I think those stories take time and they take resources, but they are deserving, and that's how I think you just keep doing it, and you don't get tired, and you have a support system around the journalists too, because it's going to be hard and infuriating, and also you will be faced with attacks. And I'm sorry to hear, Marcus, that what you were just called last week, and I'm sure we could spend a lot of time revisiting some of the ugliness that all three of us have had in our roles as journalists covering stories. But I will also say that it's important for listeners and viewers and audiences, when you see work that you like and that you think is valuable, to acknowledge that in an email to your reporter's boss, in a membership, in a subscription, all those ways, because that really matters. And that is how you can buoy us and support the work that's being done.
That's such a great point, Flora. And I think people don't realize what an impact those kinds of comments have in those emails. I think people think, oh, nobody really cares what I think, but people really do. And for every one of those that we get, there's probably about 50, at least in my case, there's like 50 that are like, I'm canceling my subscription because of you. So it's really helpful to hear to hear that sort of positive reinforcement, which segues really well into my last question before we go into the Q&A. And we've already gotten some great questions from the audience, but if you have them that you want to ask, now's the time. So the last question we had before we go to the audience questions was, how can the public or audience here support community media and help to ensure that our media covers our communities more accurately and thoroughly? Either one of you can start.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, support local journalism. Help fund it. Pay for it. Pay for it through email. Pay for it through retweeting a tweet and acknowledging why you liked a story. Join in an event and support and help publicize that. But really, I cannot underscore enough what power a single email from a listener or a reader has in our organization. And I know it matters in every organization I've ever worked. Those positive emails mean a lot. It doesn't matter if the person is a longtime leadership circle member or the casual listener who happens to listen. It means a lot. And it's also just good for our own psyches that we're doing something right, and that we're valued.
Yeah, you're here. I would also say just any financial support that you can give to organizations like KNKX, the South Seattle Emerald, Converge, wherever, there's a huge resource gap between organizations like ours that, I feel are trying to do great work, and an organization like, let's say, the Sinclairs of the world, who have a different tact. And so I think the more that we can close that resource gap, the better. And it boils down at the end of the day to finances.
Yeah, and I would just throw in too, and I completely agree with both of you that, you know, there's so many entities that I don't agree with 100% of the things that they write or say, but I support them with my dollars and my retweets, because I know that having their eyes on our city, having their perspective on what's going on in our government is beneficial to me as a reader. The more eyes looking at what our, you know, city council or mayor are doing is better for all of us. That the people that are going to be the happiest if there was no local journalism are the people that we're trying to hold accountable. And I think it's really important that, you know, sometimes people say, well, I didn't like what this person wrote, so I'm not going to support them anymore. And my thing is, yeah, you can vote with your dollars, but I want to see that entity. I want to see all the media entities survive. Like, I want to see them all thriving and healthy and doing what they do, whether or not I agree with them 100% or not all the time. So
can I add one thing?
Yeah.
Because I'm wondering if it's probably going to sound very truthful to you, is also, you might not like what we're reporting, but don't start out with the hate, because that just turns into a shouting match, and every journalist I know is trying. So instead of saying, I don't understand why you did that, maybe the better question is, please explain. Instead of like, I don't like it, I don't understand why you did something. And this is directly for communities of color, because it happened to me in my own community when I was covering race. Is sometimes there are stories that are happening within our communities that is the dirty laundry that nobody wants to talk about, that nobody wants uncovered, and those are really hard to do. And there's a preference for not talking about it. But when those stories are done, support those stories, because it is important work. It doesn't matter, especially in accountability reporting. It doesn't matter who's doing the wrong. The wrong needs to be acknowledged and reported on.
That's such a great point, Florangela. And I think people don't understand either how frightening and vulnerable it is as a, you know, reporter, journalist of color covering those kinds of stories, and how kind of cast in the sea you feel in those situations. So yeah, it's really hard. So we have some great audience questions that I want to get to. The first one is really great, which is, how are journalists shifting with the acknowledgement that there is no, quote, objective perspective? And how has that changed your work and the stories that you write? Marcus, you want to start on that one?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And while I think, and I agree that for the most part, historically, objectivity has really just been white male subjectivity. And at least in American journalism, I think what you can be, and this is what I tell all of our journalists, is what you can be and need to be is fair. You need to be accurate. And you need to, your job is to find the best obtainable version of the truth as you can find it, right? And that's obviously, that's going to potentially change Wednesday, you know, versus Thursday versus Friday. But at the end of the day, what you can do, what you want the reader to know is that you are doing your best at all possible, at all times, to be as truthful and as accurate and as fair as possible. And I think, you know, that's a practice that ultimately, you know, will never go out of style.
Thanks, Marcus. Flora?
Yeah, and I guess I would say, you know, we're fortunate, our medium is fortunate that we get to carry conversations with people. And that is a different type of storytelling, but it adds to the context and the knowledge that straight ahead, and I say straight ahead because it's a news story, something that's happening, legislation, and you present it and you acknowledge who's for it and who's against it. But a second or third take could be a deeper dive in a conversation about the impact legislation could have. And that may not need the equal weight of 2.5 minutes of this person's perspective and 2.5 minutes of that person's perspective. And if it is if it is a thoughtful conversation, if the questions are multidimensional, it can be a very good, worthwhile story for a person, regardless of their viewpoint. And you follow that with another conversation, maybe on a different day. But not every story needs to have every side in it to be a valuable and journalistically correct presentation of the news and information.
Thanks, Fleur. Marcus. As I feared, we have way more questions than we have time, and they're really good. So I wish we could have another hour, but we don't. But why don't we just finish with this question about local journalism? Is local journalism a more reliable source than national journalism?
Yes, I would say, I mean, if you want to know what's happening in your community, yes. And that is why I think all of us are champions of our profession and are stubborn and we won't leave and we're just dogged and trying to make it better, is because there are so many communities that don't have daily journalism and they don't have accountability reporting. And that means that people are suffering or are not getting their voices heard. And so I think all of us care about what's happening in our neighborhood and in our community. And so, yes, local journalism in that sense it's also, a notion of the people who are putting that product together, the way we're putting our newscast together, we're thinking about you and why this national story may matter to you locally. So we're with you. We have a common starting point. So in that sense, that is why I think you need to subscribe to the Seattle Times. You need to listen to KNKX. You need to support the South Seattle Emeralds, because the starting point is the same, is we are here, we are with you. We want you to be informed and well-rounded individuals.
Marcus?
Florangela dropped the mic. I don't, other than saying yes, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think the more proximate you are to something, right? I think the more trustworthy you're more likely to be. And just the fact that you have that local journalists, for the most part, have a vested interest, in their communities. They want to see, their communities improved and advanced, and, hopefully tell a very accurate and authentic story, because they know that, that they have to be accountable to the community that they serve, versus a national journalist potentially who's parachuting in and not to be, seen or heard from again. So.
Yep, I completely agree. And you can kind of tell when you read some of these national stories about Seattle and you're like, wait, they put Bellevue where? But it's because if you're not from here, it does not say only people from here can write good journalism about this area, but it definitely helps to have eyes and ears on the ground and people that know the region. Thank you so much, Florangela and Marcus. You were amazing, as we fully expected. And I've got to turn it back over to Lee Rochelle, but thank you so much for sharing your insights and knowledge and being a champion for local journalism, because we absolutely need it. So thank you.
Thank you as well, Naomi.
Thanks, Naomi. Thanks, Marcus.
Thank you. Bye.
Oh my, well, what an excellent conversation. I just wish that we had even more time to go more deeply. I think I'll just have to invite all of you to dinner at my house, and then I can selfishly continue this conversation. Thank you so much, Naomi and Florangela and Marcus. We just so appreciate your sharing your knowledge and your experience with us, and your work to help us eliminate racism in the media. So we are very grateful. And for our audience, after that discussion, you might even still be thinking, now what am I supposed to do about all of this? We do have two final speakers who are going to share some next steps that you can take and share a very special announcement. So I encourage you to welcome co-chairs of POCEC, Susan Mask and Renee Cogdell-Lewis.
Hi, I'm Renee Cogdell-Lewis, and I'm co-chair of the POCEC and the YWCA board member.
And I'm Susan Mask, POCEC co-chair and a longtime YWCA board member. We hope listening to our panelists discuss the importance of intersectional lenses in journalism provided some insight into how and why representation matters.
Now that you've joined us to stand against racism today, I hope you're thinking about your next steps tomorrow and each day after that. What is one action you can commit to right now to start eliminating racism in your community? It's time for all of us to stand up to our roles in dismantling systemic racism leading conversations, and doing our part to drive long-term solutions that get at the roots of iniquity. One step would be to print out the Stand Against Racism pledge and put it somewhere you can see it every day. For other ideas and suggestions, please visit ywcaworks.org for a list of resources from today's event.
And remember, you're not alone. The Stand Against Racism is all about building community and including all of the people watching this right now. We must work together in the fight for justice because the future deserves all of us. For the past 11 years, the POCEC has been committed to community education by putting on the Stand Against Racism. We are continuing to grow and expand by providing input on race and social justice issues to the YWCA board, engaging the community, and supporting events like the upcoming Bertha Pitts Campbell Equity Awards.
We'd like to invite you to join POCEC in the fight to stand against racism. To learn about becoming a member, please visit the Stand resource page on YWCA's website for more details. And last, but certainly not least, we wanted you to be the first to hear this exciting news. The keynote speaker for the YWCA's virtual Inspire Luncheon in September 2022 will be lawyer, acclaimed author, and women's rights advocate, Anita Hill.
We are thrilled to bring this feminist icon to our community, and we hope you will join us. Thank you for joining YWCA on a mission to eliminate racism and empower women.
Thanks to Susan and Renee for their leadership of the POCEC. They are fabulous leaders of our little group. And together with the YWCA, we are on a mission to stand against racism today and every day. We encourage you to visit YWCA's website for more resources about the topic of media, race, and gender, and to find a recording of today's event for yourself and to share with others. I also encourage you to check YWCA's upcoming events. Next month is Winning Within, a virtual conversation with Olympic champion Dominique Dawes. They're hosting a virtual ceremony in June to celebrate the 2022 Bertha Pitts Campbell Equity Awards honorees. And I can't wait to hear my shero, Anita Hill, at the 2022 Inspire Luncheon in September. I hope I'll see you there. Now, on behalf of YWCA Seattle, King, Snohomish, and the POCEC, thank you for being here. I encourage you to keep standing against racism today and every day, and we hope to see you again next year in April. Thank you.
We shall overcome, we shall overcome. We shall